Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Norton, Mayor of Greeley, and I'm going to say a few words just to welcome all of you, and it's great to see the crowd. I think even more people this year than last, and it's always great to see everyone that comes to listen to a wonderful speaker, and I have to thank the committee that does all the work to put this together, because they always, every year, get an extremely good speaker and someone who has some good experience and knows the issues around what happened and why it happened, and has some great philosophical background. And I think one of the things that comes to my mind as we were talking over dinner is the importance of learning what happened in the Holocaust and how some of the things that we see and feel and hear today in our society are similar, and how we should, really listen to each other and figure out the differences and not be so we're right, you're wrong, and not be able to really feel and conceive of how to resolve many of our problems. And it's just so important, and I think the lessons of the Holocaust are the ones that will teach us how to do the right things and be a better citizen and have a better society. So it's certainly a pleasure for me to welcome you. My wife Kay and I were supposed to give you a welcome, her from the university's sake, and airlines kind of got in the way of her getting here on time, so she was stuck in Indianapolis part of the day. I think she's probably close to being home by now, if not home, but I will give the welcome for her. Last year we had a little bit more fun because we'd get up and kind of banter back and forth a little bit about who was the most important, the city or the university, and of course we all know that it's the cooperation between the two that it's important. So thank you all for being here. Welcome. Enjoy the evening.
Good evening. My name is Chris Gamer, and I am the current chair of the Holocaust Memorial Observances of Greeley, Northern Colorado. And I too welcome you to the 2017 Holocaust Memorial Observances Survivor Speaker Presentation. I am encouraged to see you here this evening to listen to the testimony of our guest speaker, SteenMetz, a child survivor of the Theresienstadt concentration camp. We're very honored to have him here with us this evening. Just to let you folks know, we have Jennifer Crandall. She's a student counselor with Ames, and we have come to realize over the years that this is a very sensitive topic for a lot of folks, older folks who may be children of survivors, or anyone who may have had a traumatic experience in their life. So I'd like to point out Jennifer Crandall. If any of you are feeling a little uncomfortable, feel free to go and approach her, and she's here and available with us this evening, and we thank her for that in giving of her time. In selecting our theme for this year's observances, From Terror to Hope, all of us on the committee were motivated by the frankly terrifying increase in hate crimes, bias-motivated assaults, and shocking uptick in anti-Semitism across the world, the country, and within our communities. Yesterday, near the end of a lecture on eliminationism and genocide at Ames Community College, presenter Dr. Michael Booker noted that these are precarious times in which we currently find ourselves. Indeed, I believe it is an apt description of the current socioeconomic and political landscape, a landscape marked by incidents of violence directed at our friends, families, and neighbors, individuals who find themselves increasingly marginalized and disenfranchised, adrift in the eddies of shifting and arbitrary government policy. Now, lest many of you think these remarks will devolve into a vitriolic political rant, you can all breathe a deep sigh of relief, when I assure you that the larger focus of the committee is to press forward beyond the terror of our theme and into the more productive realm of hope. To this end, the Holocaust Memorial Observances of Greeley and Northern Colorado are fiercely committed to the humble but extremely powerful notion that education is the antidote to the poison of willful ignorance and senseless hate. During his visits with local high schools this week, Steen challenged students to be upstanders, not bystanders, to take stand when they witness bullying or other cowardly acts of hate. I think we would all do well to take up his challenge. Of course, it takes an entire community to animate and add dimension to a phrase like never forget. In that regard, the Holocaust Memorial Observances Committee would like to thank our many partners in this educational endeavor. Among those partners, of course, we'd like to especially thank the University of Northern Colorado, Kay Norton, who couldn't be here this evening, and of course the City of Greeley Mayor Tom Norton for their continued support of the observances. In addition to that, the other mayors of Evans, John Norris, and the mayor of Eaton, Kevin Ross, we are very, very grateful for their commitment to our project and our events, especially through the proclamations. And on behalf of the committee, I would also like to thank James Thompson being here in Senator Michael Bennett's stead. And we have a very special and new video message from Senator Bennett, which we'd like to share with you folks.
Hello, I'm Michael Bennett. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of tonight's program. I wish I could be there with all of you. I want to give a special thanks to Mayor Norton and to UNC President Norton and the Greeley Holocaust Observances Committee for putting together this week's events honoring victims of the Holocaust. And I want to recognize tonight's honored speaker, SteenMetz, for his bravery and willingness to share his own story. The Holocaust was one of mankind's darkest periods. As a community, a country, and a people, we must make every effort to remember these events, to learn from history, and to treasure our common humanity. This year, I've been deeply disturbed by the spate of hate crimes and desecration of our religious community centers and cemeteries. All of us in political office have a responsibility to ensure our rhetoric does not contribute or in any way inspire violence. Instead, we should be elevating stories of determination and survival. Your hard work and commitment to preserving these stories makes it possible for us to remember them. As many of you know, my own mother was born in Poland in 1938 while Nazi tanks massed at the border. She and her parents miraculously survived the Holocaust and were able to come to the United States to rebuild their shattered lives. The promise of opportunity that brought them and many more survivors here is one that we must keep for our own kids and grandkids. That message is more important now than ever. I know that with your help, we'll continue to let these stories guide our great nation toward a society that lives up to the hopes and dreams of all our children. Thank you and good night.
I'd also like to thank the entire Holocaust Memorial Observances Committee for their hard work and dedication. These individuals devote countless hours over the course of the year to making the Holocaust Memorial Observances a reality. And before I introduce Steen, I would like to introduce Brian Larson and Cheryl McBride. They are going to be providing a musical piece for us as a prelude to the evening. And I'd also like to thank Father Jack and Dorianne Stapleton for providing the slideshow which will accompany the musical selection. So we'll go ahead and do that. Thank you. And again, thank you, James, for the video. It was a lovely video when I saw it in its entirety. It was very heartfelt greeting. So I apologize for technology. It's a blessing and a bane. Now I'm going to introduce our featured guest. I'm truly honored to have met our survivor speaker, SteenMetz. Steen is the epitome of graciousness and kindness and energy. I do not know where you get your energy. You look so fresh after doing a lot of school visits. He's going to have a very busy schedule tomorrow. I'm just in awe. During the few moments I have spent with Steen during his busy school visits here in Greeley, Kersey, and Eaton, the latter of which he will visit tomorrow, I have been in awe of that energy. And this evening we are grateful for his courage and conviction in sharing his story with us for the benefit of future generations. Steen, among other Holocaust survivors, is the living manifestation of the phrase, never forget. Please let us give a warm welcome to Mr. SteenMetz.
Thank you very much, Chris, and good evening, everybody. I cannot tell you how pleased I am to see so many people. It's overwhelming, and it proves one thing. There's a great deal of interest in the Holocaust and the consequences of the Holocaust. I want to thank the Jewish Federation for making it possible, inviting me here during Holocaust Memorial Week. And it's important that we all remember why we are here. We are commemorating the death of 6 million European Jews. Out of 9 million European Jews, they all perished during the Holocaust. And there was only one reason why they perished. They happened to be born Jewish. I meant to ask you, can you hear me in the back? Okay, that's wonderful. If you have problems, please let me know. I want to talk, I'm going to share my Holocaust experiences, my personal experiences with you. And it's very, very timely that the theme of the week is Voices from the Holocaust. I'm sure most of you have read books, seen documents about the Holocaust, but tonight you're going to hear a voice from the Holocaust. Sometimes I refer to it as living history. You will hear directly from an eyewitness. When I talk to school students, I always tell them that they're going to be the last generation that will hear directly from a survivor. In about 10 or 15 years, we will not be able to stand here or anywhere to share our experiences. And I often draw a parallel to what happened 100 years ago in Turkey. 1.5 million Armenians, including the grandfather and my wife, they were killed. The Turks killed them, 1.5 million. Today, there are no survivors left. Nobody can stand anywhere to talk about it. And I want to make sure that 10 or 15 years from now, that there will still be people that will be talking about the Holocaust. We are not able to do it anymore. So I'm going to ask each person in the audience to be my ambassador. and I believe there are about 600 people. So if each person can talk to 4 people, that makes it close to 2,500 people who will know about the Holocaust. It's becoming increasingly important that we never forget for a couple of reasons. The anti-Semitism is increasing, which is very, very sad. Number 2, the people are forgetting that it ever happened. There are even people that are denying that the Holocaust ever took place. How anybody can deny that, I will never understand. It was probably one of the most documented historic events in history, in our history, with documents, the museum in Washington, D.C., many videos, many films. And General Eisenhower had a vision. He was afraid that one day there would be people that would deny that the Holocaust took place. And consequently, he took pictures of the camps when they were liberated. Excuse me. I understand the British troops and the Soviet troops also took pictures. If I may have the first slide, please. That was also the reason that I published my memoirs about the Holocaust 5 years ago. The book is self-published, and I wanted to make sure that the next generation wouldn't forget. And I called my book A Danish Boy in Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt was the camp I was in Czechoslovakia. It's now the Czech Republic. Terezin would be the Czech version, and I will use the 2 names interchangeably. Reflections of a Holocaust Survivor. Those of you that are interested in buying the book, it will be available right after our talk and questions afterwards if you're interested in purchasing it. I want to go back to 1940, and the next slide, April the 9th, 1940. It's kind of interesting when I look at the map. I was sitting next to Børge Williamson. He's also from Denmark, like I am. And it's interesting to show the map here. He's actually from what we call Viborg, on the northern part of what we call Jutland. That's where he's from. And I'm from the middle of the country. I call it Odense. Some people will call it Odense. I'm always curious because I think this is a well-traveled group, and I'm always curious to hear how many of you have been visiting Denmark? Oh, that's quite a few, quite a few. That's good to hear. But again, I'll go back to April the 9th, 1940. At that time, there were 4.5 million people living in Denmark. There were 7,500 Jewish people, a small percentage of the total population, 0.2%. And Hitler invaded Denmark on April the 9th. Troops came up through Germany into Denmark. The war machines were flying all over. Hitler had signed a non-aggression pact with Denmark and many other occupied countries. It wasn't even worth the paper it was written on. You couldn't trust the man. And I have many descriptions of Hitler. And one of my favorite ones, and when I talk to schools, I have to be careful that my description of Hitler is not too graphic. But I think calling him a ruthless murderer probably fits as well as anything I could say about him. And there wasn't much of a battle going on. Little Denmark couldn't do anything against big war machine from Germany. The battle ended after less than 1 day. There were a lot of young people that didn't like that. I'm not going to take a position one way or the other. I'll only say that it probably saved thousands of lives. The first 3.5 years, conditions were relatively normal in Denmark, certainly compared to what happened in other occupied countries, be it the Netherlands or France or Poland. We were able to continue to go to public school. My father was able to continue to practice law. It was not a Jewish company. This would not have happened if we had lived in the Netherlands or Poland. The rights were taken away from us in those countries. So why was it different in Denmark? A number of reasons, one being the relatively few Jewish people in Denmark. Hitler was busy on many different fronts, especially on the Russian front, and he didn't want to have more troops than necessary in Denmark. Also, the Germans loved the Danish food. We used to export it to Great Britain. That, of course, stopped right away, and now it was redirected down to Germany. Bacon, eggs, cheese, and so on. And the troops, the Nazi troops in Denmark, also ate the Danish food. And I was reading a story about a soldier, and he didn't want to be transferred from Denmark because they just loved the food. Denmark was important from a strategic point, from a transportation point of view. First of all, shipping Danish food down to Germany. Also, they shipped iron from Sweden, and you can barely see Sweden to the east of Denmark, and that would go through Denmark also. So those were some of the reasons why conditions were relatively normal. On the next slide, I'm going to show you King Christian X. He was one of the few royals who remained behind. Most of the royalty in Europe left their country and went to Great Britain. He was a big supporter of the Danish people, the Danish Jews. He hated Hitler, he hated the Nazis, and they didn't like to see him coming in to his home. And in defiance of the Nazis, he would continue to ride his horse every day. Here you see him all by himself, no bodyguard. He's in a park. Picture is taken in 1940. He continued to ride every day. He's being saluted by 2 German soldiers. And what I like about the picture, the king is looking straight forward. He doesn't want to have anything to do with the Nazis. There's some wonderful stories about the king. Some of them are true, others are not. But I will tell you one story, which is one of my favorites. The Germans' headquarters ended up, of course, they started occupying one of the best hotels in Copenhagen. Angleterre was the name. They started flying swastika on top of the building. The king saw it. He talked to the commandant in Denmark and said, take the flag down. And they said, no, we're in charge now. So the king said, I'll send a soldier up and he will remove the flag. And the Nazis said, we'll shoot him. Finally, the king said, I'll go up there myself. The next day, the flag disappeared. Well, that's a true story or not, I don't think that's important, but it certainly is one of my favorites. The government also continued to govern in Denmark, which was unusual. There were some restrictions. They could not employ any Jewish people, and there were a few other restrictions. I want to show the next slide, if I may. When you look at that picture, you can see I haven't changed very much since the picture was taken. But there's a much more important reason why I'm showing the picture. And I didn't realize it until some years ago. This was the last time my family and I, my father, my mother, and I were together. And it's amazing that we were on vacation the summer before we were arrested. And the country was occupied, and we had a wonderful time. And I'm reminded of the 2 ice creams I had in my hand. The other day, I went to an ice cream shop, and they had T-shirts on, and the T-shirt said, a balanced diet is an ice cream in each hand. and I thought I got a kick out of that. Unfortunately, I didn't get a T-shirt. But those relative normal conditions came to a sudden halt in the fall of 1943. Norma, can we go? Any chance we can go back to the map, if you can? And there were a number. If you can, it's fine. There were a number of reasons why it changed. Thank you. Why it changed. The underground movement accelerated greatly. Was young people, 16, 17, 18, and 19 years old. They accelerated the resistance movement. They started getting weapons from Sweden, being neutral. At night, the British would drop down weapons, and they used that. They would make bombs, and they made life difficult for the Germans, and that was their purpose. And they would bomb factories that made products for Germany. They would bomb rails, they would bomb rail cars, and they would sink ships so they couldn't use them, the Danish ship. Those young people took a great deal of risk, but they were not very happy that the government had not done more in battling for Denmark earlier. They took it in their own hands. There were small groups, had nothing to do with the government, nothing to do with the armed forces. There were groups all over in Denmark, and it was an amazing resistance movement. Some of the young people, I just read a book about it, paid for it. Young people, there were two brothers, I think they were 16 and 18 years old. They ended up in jail, and they spent close to 2 years in jail. So the commandant in Denmark gave the Danish government an ultimatum. The ultimatum was, you need to arrest the saboteurs, you have to sentence them to death. There was no way the Danish government would agree to do that. They resigned, and that became the beginning, what we refer to as a final solution, the roundup of the Danish Jews. Once again, Denmark was different. I think different than all the other occupied countries. I think there were well over 20 occupied countries in Europe. A Nazi diplomat, heard about the date, and when the government resigned, that was in late September 1943. So that diplomat who had ties with Denmark heard about the date, notified the government, the administration, and they in turn told the Jewish congregation about it. Most of the Danish Jews, they were totally integrated into the society, but most of them lived in the area around Copenhagen. My family was an exception. So over the next 2 weeks, an amazing thing happened in Denmark. And as Chris mentioned earlier, my new phrase of upstanders, and the Danish people were standing up to the discrimination that happened in Denmark and other places. And they did what they thought was the right thing to do. In Denmark, at that time, you are first of all a Dane. Doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or whether you're Lutheran or whether you're a Catholic. So over those 2 weeks, about 7,000 Danish Jews were hiding in private homes. They were taken to hospitals by ambulances. They were registered in hospitals under false names. They were hiding in lofts, in church lofts. My cousin was hiding there. They were hiding in private homes. There were taxis that would drive them around. It was an amazing effort. And that's why I refer to them as upstanders. And if we can have bystanders, we can also have upstanders. And I hope one of these days we'll get the word upstander into the Webster's Dictionary. I think there are too many people that are standing by even today, and there are not enough people that are upstanders. So while 95% of the Danish Jews were on their way to Sweden, I lived in Odense, and we had not, to my knowledge, been warned, alerted. And I have to emphasize, which I always do to students, I probably don't have to do it today, but it's good to keep in mind that the communication, the channels, were quite different in those days. We didn't have TV, we didn't have computers, we certainly didn't have iPhones. The Nazis cut off all the phone lines so we couldn't talk. And one early morning, on October 2nd, 1943, it was Rosh Hashanah, Jewish New Year. 2 Gestapo officers knocked on our door. We lived on the 3rd floor in an apartment. I didn't know what was going on. Why did they come to our door? Why didn't they go next door? Why didn't they go below? I knew, I was 8 years old. I knew we were occupied. I would bicycle to and from school every day. I would see I always refer to them as the ugly green uniform of the soldiers marching up and down, and I would try to avoid them. But I didn't know I was Jewish. I had not been brought up in the Jewish faith. My father was brought up in the Jewish faith. My mother was not. So when I talk to schools, middle school, high schools, whatever it may be, I always say, is it a crime to be Jewish? Is it a crime to be a Catholic? Is it a crime to be Lutheran? Of course not. But it's a crime to be Jewish in Hitler's evil eyes. I know there were other minorities that went to camp also, but I'm going to focus on the Jewish people. If we can go forward, please, to the one with the next one, please. Next one. Perfect. We got about an hour to get ready. Then we were transported in the truck you see on the left. It's a very, very unique picture. It was taken of a person on a balcony opposite. Supposed to be the only picture taken of the arrest of the Jewish people. There were 60 people in the schoolyard, most of them from the island we lived on, some of them from Jutland. I don't remember too much about it other than I believe we were there for a couple of hours. The Germans were shouting. You never get used to their shouting, but this was really the first time I heard it. I didn't understand German. My mother and father understood some. I believe they were counting. I don't know how long it takes to count to 60, but it seems to take them a long, long time. Thereafter, in the next slide, please, we were herded into, historians refer to it as a boxcar or a cattle car. They call it a boxcar, a rail car. Survivors like myself refer to it as a cattle car. That's what it was, and I'm sure most of you have seen pictures of the cattle car. It's hard to imagine spending over 3 days and 3 nights in the cattle car, having no idea where we are going. I was 8 years old. I was frightened. There were 4 children like myself. We were able to lie down. The rest of the people, can you imagine spending more than 80 hours standing or sitting down for that length of time? It was completely dark inside. There were no windows. I'm often asked, did anybody escape? You couldn't escape. It was completely enclosed, and even the door where we entered, they locked it to make sure that nobody escaped. There were no benches. There were no chairs, no blankets. We got no food, nothing to drink, other than what we had brought ourselves, and we shared it with other people. I believe the adults were equally frightened. The atmosphere was getting very tense. The smell was getting worse and worse. We did not have bathroom facilities. We had to use buckets in the corner. We made one stop. The stop lasted, I don't know, maybe half an hour, an hour. We got something to drink, and we were back in the cattle car. And then we arrived, next slide please. Then we arrived in Terezin, and Terezin at that time was located in Czechoslovakia. Today is the Czech Republic. It was located 40 miles north of Prague. Next one, please. It was about 550 miles from Denmark to the camp. On the left, you see the station. On the right, you see inmates walking from the train station into camp. And it was about 1.5 miles or 2 miles away. As soon as we arrived, we had to empty our pockets. They took our money, they took jewelry, anything valuable. I still remember they were not able to take my mother's wedding ring off. She kept it on, which was amazing. All the other wedding rings they took. And I don't know if you've seen pictures, but there have been pictures, a big stack of jewelry, including rings. So my mother kept the ring, and now my oldest daughter has the ring. They also went through our luggage to find anything valuable. We were split up right away, men, women, seniors, and children in separate barracks. I don't know how, but somehow my mother was able to convince the authorities that we could stay at the same barrack, which was quite unusual, although it did happen to other people. Before I describe living conditions, I want to talk a little bit about Terezin. Terezin was a concentration camp. It was not an extermination camp. There were 6 extermination camps, all in Poland. The most infamous was Auschwitz-Birkenau. There were about 1.5 million Jews that ended up in that camp. I'm often asked, why don't I have a tattoo on my arm? I don't. The perception is that all survivors have a tattoo, and I thought so for many, many years until I started doing research. It was only and only, in quote, the inmates from Auschwitz-Birkenau that had a tattoo. And then I even met a lady from Auschwitz, and she did not have a tattoo. Terezin, like most concentration camps, were also slave labor, cheap labor. And suddenly, my father, an attorney, he was used to practicing law. He was used to litigating in the courthouse. The winter was starting. He was exposed to some heavy road work. He had to dig ditches. He wore an overcoat. They got no uniforms. And from a witness, a younger person who worked with my father, I was told that suddenly there was a guard that came up and said, or literally tore the coat off him and took it. They didn't provide uniforms, so my father got very cold. It was hard for him since he wasn't used to that kind of work, and I can understand that. Of course, the Nazis couldn't understand it. Most inmates were physically or psychologically exposed. Many both. My father was physically abused. I heard that from the witness. It hurt a lot when I read about it, but I'm not surprised. We were all treated in an inhuman way because Nazi and his people didn't consider us human beings. So my father was whipped, he was kicked very subjectively when a guard would be watching him and he might not have been digging enough ditches. They even gave us a little more food when we worked. I think my father got a couple of extra slices of bread, but it wasn't enough. He couldn't handle it, and he ended up in infirmary, and they had some great, great doctors, inmates from the camp, and they tried to save my father, who had lost half his body weight. They didn't have enough tools, they didn't have enough medical supplies, and he died at the young age of 40 after my parents had been married for about 10 years. When I tell you that the Nazis did not list starvation on his death certificate, I'm sure you won't be surprised. They listed it as pneumonia. There was no way they were going to publicize it as starvation. My mother, to my knowledge, was not physically abused, but she was certainly mentally abused on a number of occasions. I give you one example. She was working in a factory. She was working with a mineral called mica, and they would cut it in small, narrow slices, and it would be used as insulation material for the war machines. And there were probably about 200 or 300 people on the floor. At the end of the day, an officer came in and asked my mother how she was feeling, and she said, "Not very well." "Why?" "I just lost my husband." "How did you lose your husband?" And my mother said he died from starvation. She told me later on that the women on the floor circled around her when the officer left, and they were very concerned that my mother had been honest. It could have had some serious consequences. So to set an example, terrorize the group, dehumanize the group, the women on the floor, that same officer came back for the next 7 days and asked the same question, and now my mother had to say that my father died of pneumonia. That's the way they were. I can give you other examples, but I think you get the picture. And I want to talk a little bit about my work. Being 8 years old, I didn't have to work, but my mother thought some voluntary work would be good. Time would fly faster. So I became a messenger. And what does a messenger do? And when I talk to students, again, I have to remind them that communications were so different in those days. So my job was to take some Nazi documents and messages from one office to the other, and I would do that for about an hour in the morning, an hour in the afternoon. You don't need a messenger anymore. You just push a button, and the documents are gone from one office to the other. But this was a different time, and it kept me occupied, and it probably kept me out of trouble as well. I should tell you that my mother and father, like other prisoners, worked some long hours. They worked 10 hours a day. There were no weekends. There were no Christian holidays. There were no Jewish holidays either. When I finished working, I would get back to the barrack. I would pass the kitchen. At the end of the kitchen, there were some big sacks of raw potato. I would look around to make sure nobody was watching, but wanted to make sure that nobody saw me, and I would help myself. I would put a raw potato in each pocket, and my mother and I would share it when I got back to the barrack. That helped us make another day. And in a little while I'll tell you about the food, and you'll understand why we needed all the help we could get. Apparently, I did it more often than I realized. And after liberation, and when my mother and I got back to Denmark, she told me she was really concerned that it was going to be habit forming. She actually said I was concerned that you would be a kleptomaniac. Fortunately, that was not the case, but I must have done it maybe more times than I should. I don't need to spend a lot of time telling you the kind of food we got. At breakfast, substitute coffee with some bread, sometimes margarine. On the next slide, you'll see what I call soup. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot that completely. Thank you, Norma. This is a picture of a loft illustration, very similar to where my mother and I lived, very similar to where my father lived. We lived in bunk beds, and I'm sure you've seen similar pictures before, wooden bunk beds. They gave us straw mattresses. They called them straw mattresses. Was very little straw in it. We were basically lying directly on the wood, and we had a thin blanket over us. It was very cold in the winter. It was very hot in the summer. And I woke up sometimes at night. Being 8 years old, I didn't realize what was going on. I would be scratching myself. My mother later on told me it came from lice, fleas, or bedbugs. We had many of them. I should also mention that we did not have, you saw prisoners before in what I call striped pajamas uniforms. In Tersen, we did not have to wear those uniforms. We wore our own clothes. We all wore a Star of David. If you were 6 years or older, you wore a Star of David. And heavens forbid, if we forgot to put it on, if we changed clothing, they could have very serious consequences. Let me go back to food. And I talked about breakfast, and if you could have the next slide, please. I call that the soup kitchen. We would stand in line maybe for 30 or 45 minutes. We would wait for the menu of the day. It was probably potato soups, more days than none. They called it potato soup. If they had regulation about truth in menu, it wouldn't pass because it was boiled water with potato peel. I never thought about it at the time, but who ate the mass of the potato? Probably the guards. In the beginning, or not just in the beginning, but we tried to get to the bottom of the kettle. We would line up with our bowls and spoons, and we could get more nourishment by getting more potato peels. And we would get bread with it. At dinner, repeat itself. About once a week, we would get a typical German pasta dish called dumpling. So how were we able to survive, not only on those meager rations, but there was very little nutrition in them, very little vitamin in them. 40,000 inmates out of 140,000 over a 3.5-year period passed away, most of them from starvation, others from different diseases like typhus. That's 40,000 out of 140,000. Fortunately, after 6 months, we started getting packages from Denmark and Sweden. We had a tremendous support system. The packages came from friends and families in Denmark and Sweden, also from Red Cross. All nations were entitled to get packages. We probably got more than anybody because of the support of the Danish people. Of course, if I tell you that we didn't always get the packages, you won't be surprised. One day, my mother was unwrapping a package. She couldn't understand why it was so heavy. Normally, you had packages with food, clothing, and vitamins. And you can appreciate we needed vitamins with the food we were getting. But she didn't find any food, no clothing, no vitamins. Why was it so heavy? They had put stones in the package. The guards had taken all the good stuff and replaced it with stones. I still get very, very upset. I get the chills when I tell the story. How cruel can the guards be? One thing, I'm not saying they got enough to eat, but they certainly got more than we did. And if they wanted to steal the package, don't replace it with stones. So what else did a 9-year-old boy do in camp? I played with other children. When I think back, it's amazing. I actually played soccer. And we had a gravel field. And I especially played with some Czech children. And I'm often asked, how were we able to communicate when we played with other children? The common language was German. I didn't know it. My mother and father knew some. But apparently I knew the Czech language. I learned it phonetically, and I was able to speak to the Czech children. And you didn't have many good moments in the camp. But when I played soccer with my Czech friends, you try to forget everything else and live in the moment. And then one day, the Czech children didn't show up. I went back to the barrack at the end of the day, told my mother about it, told her I was really sad because we had become very, very friendly. And she said, don't worry, they'll be back in a few days. They were probably ill. You'll see them again. She knew exactly what had happened to those poor children, but didn't want to tell me about it. She didn't want, and if I may have the next slide. There you see cattle cars again. Those poor children were deported to an extermination camp, more than likely Auschwitz-Birkenau. You see the Gestapo officer on the right, and you see they're literally being pushed or herded into the cattle car. It's amazing that I wasn't aware of that for a number of years. I've been told to have some terrible scenes at the station, and there were 90,000 out of 140,000 in the Theresienstadt that ended up in extermination camps, including my Czech friends. You may remember on the slides earlier, at the station you saw 2 rows of people, and I'm sure many of you have seen that before. There was a doctor that would sort them out, and 1 row would go directly to the gas chamber. That would be an extermination camp, and the other row would be slave labor. Could we have the next slide, please? I went back to Terezin in year 2009. I wanted to see it for myself as a free person, and I also wanted to do some research for my book. I was very, very moved when I saw my name in the 4th line, Metz Steen 5535. That's when I was born. You'll see another Metz next to me. This is a cousin, 3 years younger. The rest of my family lived in Copenhagen, and they all tried to escape to Sweden, and they all succeeded, except Alan's and his family, his father and mother, and my father's mother. They were caught on the way and ended up in Theresienstadt also. But I'll never forget it. There were 15,000 names of children that passed through Terezin, engraved on the walls and on the ceiling. There were less than 10% or less than 1,500 that survived. I'm going to skip the next 2 slides because I'm looking at my watch, and I want to make sure that we have time for questions. And I always like to talk about the subjects that you want to talk about. And now we are getting to what I call happier times. And there's a picture of the white buses. The white buses came from Sweden. Again, Sweden was a neutral country. And on all the sides, they had the Swedish flag and the Red Cross on them. And they saved 15,000 inmates during, I think, between February and April. We were liberated on April the 15th, 1945. I'm often asked, did you know what was going on in the rest of the world? I sure didn't. I was 9 years old. I don't believe my mother or father, my mother knew very much about what was going on. I believe sometimes you got some false rumors, but basically you didn't know what was going on. We were warmly greeted on the buses, driven by Danish and Swedish drivers. They were very, very courageous because the war was still going on, was coming to an end. We didn't know. The Germans certainly knew that they were losing the battle, fortunately. The Allied troops would come from the west, the Soviets from the east. It was a miracle. They were able to drive through Germany and back up again. I still remember heavy bombardment. We had to stop, and we were outside a forest, and we stopped for several hours. I remember we had curtains. I looked out, and I saw a number of German soldiers. I'll never forget the sight. They must have run out of adults. They look like boys, 16, 17, maybe not even 18 years old. So on the next picture, you'll see our warm welcome in Denmark. If you return to Poland, you would not get that kind of welcome. There was too much anti-Semitism in Poland. There was very little in Denmark. We got food. We got some more chocolate for children. We were warned, don't eat too much of the rich food because you haven't had much to eat for a while, and we had to be very careful. And it's amazing when I look at the picture that we were greeted with that number of people, and Denmark was still occupied. The agreement was that we could not stay in Denmark because we were still occupied. We went over to Sweden. We were in quarantine for about a week. They wanted to make sure we didn't bring any diseases into the country. And we got a warm welcome. We left the quarantine, and I'll never forget that my mother was standing, say, here, and then maybe her mother was less than halfway through the room. Her mother was standing there. She was in Sweden all the time. It was the first time we reconnected with the family after 18 months. And my mother wanted to run down and embrace her mother. She couldn't. She was just too weak. And I can still see that. It was wonderful to be reconnected with the family. And about a week later, if I may have the next slide, a week later, Germany finally surrendered after 5 long years. And we were not in Denmark at that time. We were in Sweden. This is a picture of a Danish flag, and they were flying it everywhere. They probably used the flag more than any other nation. And Denmark has continued to fly the Danish flag every May the 5th. And I don't know if you notice, but my birthday is also on May the 5th. And every year I would tell all my friends and anybody who would listen that they're flying the flag to celebrate my birthday. Thank you. So a couple of weeks later, my mother and I returned to Denmark, forever grateful what General Eisenhower and the Allies did. And it was wonderful to be back. It was difficult without my father. There was no schooling in any camp. There were some private lessons. I got some private lessons when we got back. I was able to go back to my old classmates, which was amazing. But I think it helped me transition. And everybody, they were very, very friendly. They couldn't help us enough. Our apartment has been rented out. We stayed with some friends until we got an apartment. My mother had to go out and work. She worked in a factory, and I would get back to school. And I would be, there was such a nice teacher that took me under her wings. And I was sitting in her yard, and I can't remember what she taught me. But I've always been very fond of food, and I remember there was a big bowl of nice red strawberries. That I remember, and I enjoyed them very much. Some years later, I graduated from high school. Then I graduated from business college. I wanted to see part of the world since Denmark was a very small country, and I joined a Danish food company, and most of their business was abroad. And they sent me to England and Canada, and then eventually to the United States. And I've been here since 1962, and I retired in '99. I always worked for food companies. I left the Danish company later on, but I worked for some other food companies like Særlig and Kraft. Maybe subconsciously, I didn't think about it at the time. I wanted to make sure that I would always have enough to eat. I've always been very fond of food. Then, in 1999, I retired, and the last 5 years, it's been a major passion of mine to talk to people like yourself, students, whoever will listen, because it's important for me to spread the word, especially in today's world, what is happening out there. I don't even want to touch that subject. But over the last 5 years, I've talked to about 40,000 people, and if each person talked to 4 people, as my ambassador. That makes it 160,000, and that makes me very happy. And I think it's time for me to close my comment by thanking all of you for coming. It's overwhelming. I think there's not a vacant seat in here, and I'm very pleased, and I want to thank the Jewish Federation again for making that possible. And this is a good time to start questions, and I think we have some microphones to... Oh yes, thank you. Thank you. This is my website. Up on, if anybody's interested in more information, communication, or some background information, that is my website. So I will try and answer any question you have. If they're personal, I will try and answer them as well.
We're going to put some mics out here for the, we want to put some mics out here, get them working first, so that people can ask. Can we have your mic, Steve? And then we'll make sure that one works up there.
Does this one work? Can you hear me?
That one works.
Question? I'll bring a mic to you. Yeah, okay, this is easy, front row.
Mr. Metz, did I understand right that you you were able to live with your mother?
Yes, that's
Because
correct.
we heard last year from the speaker that the children who were able to do that were much more likely to survive.
To be what?
To survive.
More likely to survive because we lived with our mother?
Yeah.
That's interesting. I'd not heard that. Maybe that's the reason I'm still here. I don't know. But this was the exception. I understand, for those of you, I don't know him, and I don't know exactly what he talked about, but I believe Peter Daniel, who's also from Theresienstadt, was here last year, and more than likely he was in a separate barrack, I would think.
No, he was with his mother.
He was also with his mother. Interesting. Does that answer your question? No. Can you hear me in the back?
Who else? Oh, I hear that no one heard the question in the back. The question was that Margie Rothaus had heard that survival was more likely for children who were in the camps with their parents, in this particular case with their mothers. And Mr. Metz said that that was a very unusual situation, and that perhaps his survival was in fact attributable to the fact that he was with his mother. And so that's something interesting. Who else would like to speak? Question. I'll bring a mic to you. Got to see hands. Okay? Meet me.
Norma, don't you have a mic on each side?
First of all, thank you for speaking. It was wonderful. When speaking to young people, like in high schools and colleges, what is some of the challenging things to get them to believe? We heard last night one of the questions from a young person was, did you ever have any joy at the camp?
Did I ever what?
Did you ever have any joy at the camp?
Yes.
And I thought to myself, why would a young person think? But anyway, what would be some challenges you've had in trying to get young people to believe what you went through?
First of all, I'm amazed at the attention I get when I talk to students. I talked to 3 groups of high school students here. They've been very attentive. They've been very engaged. And I have talked to close to 350 groups, and say 300 of them at least were students. I only had problems 2 times, and that was minor. I'm being told by teachers that they are mesmerized by my comments, they are in awe of my comments, and I've even been told some of the jaded students sit there, and the teachers are amazed. When I started talking to students about 5 years ago, I didn't know how it would go. I never talked to students, and I didn't intend to do it. But right from the beginning, I talked to my grandson's class. My oldest daughter arranged it when he was in middle school. And I was very hesitant because I thought they would all fiddle with their phones and so on. But they don't. And they are very, very respectful. And this was kind of a trial. And afterwards, my daughter and I talked about it. We thought it went well. My presentation was completely different in those days. I would read passages from my book and answer some questions. And then a day or two later, a friend of my grandson came up to him and said, "Your grandpa was awesome." And when a teenager tells me that I'm awesome, I thought that was the beginning to my new career.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to ask if you still remember something from Czech, because I'm from there.
You're from? No, I don't. I'm sorry. I wish I did. That's interesting. But I learned it phonetically, and my mother didn't believe that I spoke the Czech language, and I was tested by a Czech lady, and I passed with flying honors. And I think I forgot it as soon as afterwards. I'm really sorry that we're not able to communicate in the Czech language.
That's fine.
Thank you.
Say thank you in Czech.
Děkuju.
Is that thank you?
Yes.
That was a lucky guess.
So I imagine you met a lot of people when you were in the camp. Have you kept in touch with anyone you've met from the camp?
I don't know if you could all hear it, but have I kept in touch with anybody from the camp? And not very many people from the people or the kids I played with that I kept in touch with. If I lived in Copenhagen, it would be different. There are several survivors in Copenhagen. I have kept in communication with them basically via email. But I'm on what we call the Speakers Bureau on the Holocaust Museum in Skokie. And we are a total of 4 survivors from Theresienstadt. And I communicate a lot with them. And it's kind of interesting, but it's typically after the war, whether you're a liberator or whether you're a survivor, you don't talk very much about it. You want to move forward. Now, I cannot talk enough about it. And I heard rumors that they were building a gas chamber in Tersen towards the end of the war when Hitler wanted to make sure that all the Jewish people died. And it was true. They started building the gas chamber in April, and then it was supposed to be operational in mid-May. And this person I talked to was 10 years older than me. We were liberated on April the 15th. It's very eerie when you think back about it. I mean, how it's a miracle. Number 2, the camp was liberated on May the 8th, and it was liberated by the Russians, but the people could not go, inmates could not go home or leave the camp because there was diseases, especially typhus, so they had to stay there for several weeks. I hope that answers your question.
We have 3 people lined up over on the right.
Oh, hello. Thank you for coming. I have 2 questions that might be kind of difficult, maybe, and linked. So they are, do you consider Sweden at the time to have been bystanders or upstanders? And then I have the same question about the United States.
Oh, those are good questions. The question about Sweden, it's a difficult question. They're both difficult questions. I think they were both upstanders and bystanders. They were bystanders in the beginning of the Holocaust. They wanted to remain neutral, but they also wanted to make sure that they would continue to export their iron from Sweden. But I think they were more upstanders than bystanders because they opened their borders. I believe there were about 15,000 refugees from Denmark, half of them Jewish people, rest of them policemen, saboteurs, and so on. So I would consider them more upstanders and bystanders. And I'm very happy that you're using the phrase of upstander. I have some mixed feeling about upstanders as far as the United States is concerned. I think there were bystanders for much too long. Most of you have heard about Elie Wiesel. In his book, Night, he says something like this: how could civilized countries remain silent for so long? I echo that. Most recently, they have found documents in the United Nations that the Allies knew about the camps as early, I think it was December 42. So they were bystanders for a long, long time. But there were certainly also upstanders. And I'm not taking the easy way out, but I think that's the best way I can answer your question. Because I don't know that I would be standing here if they hadn't entered the war. Of course, some of us would have hoped that they would have entered the war earlier. There's been several books written. Should they have bombed the rails into Auschwitz? They knew about it. So the question will go on. Hopefully I answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And keep using the word upstander.
I totally will. I'm a teacher, and I'm like teaching it tomorrow.
Oh, great, great.
Okay, so if you do remember your worst experience in the camp, what would it be?
Worst, and it's gruesome what I'm going to tell you. But I'm going to answer your questions just like I've answered similar questions in the past. My father passed away, as I mentioned, and my mother was asked to identify his body. She didn't know what to do with me, and I went with her. And we went to several different places, and eventually my mother identified it. And seeing the body, that was the worst thing that happened. Thank you very much for asking the question.
Oh.
Hi. So
Hi.
You've worked with a lot of students. I wanted to know what your favorite experience was to work with the youth across America.
What my favorite experience was in the camp?
No, to work with students and tell them your experiences. What's your favorite part of doing that?
I think the question is, what was your favorite experience in working with audiences, including students?
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. I have.
That's what I think the question is. Did I get it right?
I had some wonderful experiences, and this is a very somber subject, and I like humor, but you can't use it very often. But I'll tell you two stories.
Steen, we can't hear you back here.
I'm sorry. Thank you for reminding me. I will tell you two stories. One being that I talked to high school students, and I told them how old I was, and basically the same talk as tonight. A junior high school student came up to me afterwards, very quietly said, "Was there any dating going on in Theresienstadt?" And I said, "I don't know, there might have been some, but I really don't know. I wouldn't think there would be a lot." So very quietly he said, "Did you do any dating in camp?" So I said, "I don't know about you, but I didn't do any dating when I was 9 years old." Another one, it's a young girl who asked me if I had any grandsons. And I told her, I was curious why she wanted to know if I had a grandson. But I told her I had a grandson. She asked how old he was, and I think she was 12 or 13. At that time, my grandson was 15. She said, "The reason I ask you, I really like to have you as my grandpa." I thought that was very cute. It's I have a lot of, it's very satisfying, to talk to any groups. I always learn something new, and some of them, they're very cute.
Thank you. We have a question, a lady right here beside me.
Thank you very much for coming and sharing. You had stated that you and your mother had met your grandma in Sweden. How did you know to go to Sweden, and how did she know you were coming since there was no form of communication?
She was already in Sweden. She had escaped to Sweden. And the entire family, about 14 or 15, managed to escape to Sweden, except the two families that I mentioned went to Theresienstadt. I think she knew about us coming because Sweden was a neutral country and there certainly was communication on the phone, and somehow she knew about coming to see us, and I think she had waited for it a long, long time. I heard later on that my mother's mother had been told that my father and mother and I were on our way to Sweden, and it was very hard to understand that later on she was told, no, it was the wrong people. But that was, hopefully I answered your question. If not, please ask me some more.
All right,
Thank
we
you.
have a question back here.
Thank you very much for coming and visiting us and sharing your experiences. You mentioned that in the camp, you took some informal classes. I've heard of other situations like this where prisoners of war and so on somehow organize classes for each other, for students. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because I'm always curious when people put that kind of thing together.
Okay, thank you very much. There was a person, I thought he was much older than me, but it turned out to be he was 17 or 18 years old. And he helped me with some subjects, I don't know, maybe reading and math. It took place in barracks. You had to be very careful because it's difficult to get the adults to teach the children because they would be working most days. So it was very seldom that you had the opportunity. There were apparently more informal sessions, as I understand it, in the children's barracks, where they would try and get a group of children together, and then there would be somebody teaching them. It could be a teacher, or it could be a mother, or whatever it was, or it could be a father. But there was a very limited window where you could get lessons, and you also had to watch it. There was no official schooling going on in any camp. Does that answer your question? Yes. Thank you very much.
I have the microphone over here. There's one over there. Here's a question. There's a question. There's another one. Okay, we'll stay right here.
Thank you. You did answer some of my questions about what was life like after you were liberated? What was life like after you left the camp? Where did you live? Who did you live with? Who supported you? And so forth.
Thank you. Could you all hear the question? Good. My family thought that my mother would go back to Copenhagen. That's where she lived most of her life. But she wanted to go back to my hometown, Odense, where she had lived since she got married. She had established friends there. And I think I mentioned we were very well received. The apartment we lived in had been rented out. There was a shortage of apartments. The belongings in the apartment were stored by the legal company where my father worked. So most of our belongings we got. My mother had to go out and work. She had to work in a factory initially. And she was able to get a smaller apartment. And I think the only reason she was able to get it was the legal company helped my mother out. We got some compensation, not a lot, but we got some compensation from the Danish government.
Another question right here.
So you talked about being a messenger, correct? So how did the guards treat you? Because you said it was voluntary. And also, was there anything that you maybe understood that, looking back now, you kind of wish you would have, I guess, told maybe the allies or
something I would have done different? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. I tried to avoid the guards, and I was never mistreated by any guard. I don't know if I'm not aware of them mistreating other children, but I certainly know that they mistreated the adults a great deal. I cannot really think of anything I would have done differently. I don't want to second guess my parents because I don't know exactly what happened, why they didn't try to escape to Sweden. A lot of my mother's friends right after the war asked her, why didn't you escape to Sweden? And she said, we didn't think it was serious. We didn't think that we would be arrested. So I can't really say I would do anything different. I wish we had escaped. And I remember as a 10-year-old boy, this smart guy said to his mother, if this happens again, let's make sure we go to Sweden. Hopefully this answers your question.
I think that's a good question on which to end. Let's give Mr. Metz a round of applause, please.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steen. Thank you for coming to be with us. Everybody, especially you very young people that are here, remember, you are witnesses by proxy, as Mr. Metz said. We owe Mr. Metz a great deal of thanks for coming to share with us.